Hey, good afternoon to you. It is now 5:06 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news. You can join us today, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Always appreciate your contributions. You know, yesterday I played some audio for you of Breonna Keeler. She is a CNN host trying to diminish J.D. Vance's service as a combat correspondent for the United States Marine Corps, meaning he's a U.S. Marine who's there in a war zone in Iraq, gathering information about how the Marines are doing their job in a very dangerous environment. And she made it seem like it wasn't a big deal. She said he wasn't kicking indoors or anything. He worked in public affairs, she said yesterday, by virtue of trying to defend Tim Walz's lies about his military service. And I was curious, what would happen today, whether or not she would go on the air and address any of this. She did, at least in part. Here is a little bit of the audio of her today, I guess, trying to bring some of this up and trying to walk back some of her claims about J.D. Vance.
Informed observers connected to politics or the military, myself included, have noted that the Trump campaign is swift.
Her husband, I believe, is a Green Beret. She says she's an informed observer.
Voting Tim Walz. Attacks on J.D. Vance's service are also offensive. J.D. Vance served honorably in Iraq, a combat zone where anything can happen and frequently does. As he said in his book, he was, quote, lucky to escape any real fighting. That doesn't make his service less than. Lucky, he says. And luck is often what makes the difference in a combat zone or even a training mission. That today is not your day. In a country where so few shoulder the burden, military service should not be a liability. It should be an asset. And despite our recent years as a country at war, many service members haven't seen combat. That doesn't make them or their service
Listen to her try and save her career.
Less admirable or less necessary. Nor does retiring from the National Guard after 24 years.
Oh, what a scam. Okay, so she continues to try and cover up for Tim Walz. There was a Marine who was on today with Breonna Keeler, a former public affairs person, Marine, on the air, who lectured Breonna Keeler rightfully about what she said yesterday and how she got it so wrong.
And I've also seen the criticism.
This is Major Sean Haney speaking.
Just going to point out that I saw yesterday where you talked about combat correspondent, and that's important to me as well. And that's not just about J.D. Vance. That's about all of my Marines, but not just Marines. All combat correspondents, public affairs Marines, combat camera Marines, graphic artists, all of those Marines and other service members whose job it is to go where the action is, wherever that is, and to tell the story. And those people, there's a hall in our public affairs school called Defense Information School of 130 heroes that served in that capacity who did not make it out of a combat zone. So that's important to me as well. That's why I'm here today, to represent my Marine, J.D. Vance, represent his service, probably try to send a message to all veterans, stand on your record, it's enough, but also defend those of us whose job it is to tell that Marine Corps story and to go wherever that story is.
Yeah, there you go. So she goes on the air today. And so, again, this is all in the service of saving Breonna Keeler's career on CNN as people were rightfully dogging her for her nonsense yesterday. Here to talk about that story and so much more from Hot Air, we're joined now by David Strom. David, good afternoon, sir. Good to have you back with us.
Oh, my gosh, Vince, and there's so much to talk about. This guy is my governor.
Tim Walz?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's the Minnesota governor, and I actually worked on a campaign against him. I mean, the funny thing is that this issue has been around since 2005, and, you know, so much of what they are saying today,
yes,
it's just flat-out lie. I mean, it was known. There's a press release from Tim Walz when he was announcing his campaign where he acknowledges that he knows he might be deployed to Iraq.
Totally. This is, let me, if I can I quote from it? Because I have this. I was really struck by this. Like, usually it's harder to gather the details here when you're trying to demonstrate that somebody's lying to you. You usually can't just go to their old campaign website and establish it really easily. Here you go. So this is March 20th, 2005. The headline on their own press release is, Walz still planning to run for Congress despite possible call to duty in Iraq. And the press release declares that it is likely that all or a portion of Walz's battalion could be mobilized to serve in Iraq within the next 2 years. And when he was asked about his possible deployment, he said, quote, "I do not yet know if my artillery unit will be a part of this mobilization, and I'm unable to comment further on specifics of the deployment." They go on to say that although his tour of duty in Iraq may coincide with his campaign for Minnesota's first congressional seat, Walz is determined to stay in the race. As Command Sergeant Major, I have a responsibility not only to ready my battalion for Iraq, but also to serve if called on. So here he is, in his own words, saying he's aware that this deployment is coming, and he bailed on these guys, David, and they're angry about it.
Oh, they're very angry about it. I saw something, this came out in the past hour, where the pastor, I forget what they call it, but
chaplain?
The chaplain came out and basically called him a coward. The chaplain from the unit. He actually said cowardly, and that just is. That's devastating. The thing about Tim Walz, he's got this sort of Joe Biden-esque tendency to inflate his resume. Joe Biden was very, let's say, aware of the fact that he's not the brightest bulb in the universe and never was. So he kept on inflating his resume. He was at the top of his class and, in law school and all of that. Well, Tim Walz does the same thing. Everything that he talks about, in his resume is inflated. He wasn't really a high school football coach. He was an assistant coach. He was one of the guys who, just sort of was around there. And, this whole idea that, he was a command sergeant major, he was, temporarily elevated to that on a conditional level if he completed the coursework and served for 3 years. He made a 3-year commitment, and he bailed out after 6 months, which is why they demoted him to an E8 instead of an E9, a master sergeant.
Yeah.
And the thing is that he has nothing to be ashamed about in terms of what he did. He was never deployed, but he was there. He stood ready for 24 years, but then when they asked him to actually, go, he bails out.
So you mentioned critically that this is not a new issue in terms of the awareness of this as a liability for him politically, and what I want to know, and I keep asking, is how the hell did the Kamala campaign miss this? This is an obvious thing, and they chose Tim Walz knowing that this was going to be an obvious thing they needed to answer for, and they got caught flat-footed. They're literally, in the last 24 hours, editing their own website to erase the lies in his bio. How do they get caught so flat-footed, David?
Oh, well, I think it's pretty simple. He's not Jewish. And he is the San Francisco liberals. Don't forget that Kamala is a San Francisco liberal. So what she knows about the Midwest couldn't fill a shot glass. So to her, he appears to be the sort of aggressive but avuncular guy who looks like a farmer and thinks, well, that's going to appeal to people in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, when in fact he's a radical guy. Yes. And, he's lied through his teeth. He endorsed the book, Winning the Wellstone Way, that refers to him as an Afghanistan veteran. And right after that is a quote from Tim Walz where he doesn't mention that he went to Afghanistan, but he clearly read the book because on the back of the book, he's endorsing it. And no one endorses a book that has quotes from you and a biography of you that is completely wrong without knowing it. I mean, it just does not happen.
If there's one section of the book he's reading, it's that one.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I know people will endorse books, for a friend and just say something generically nice. But if you're quoted in it, you are one of the examples. You read that,
sure.
Especially if you're a politician, because you know that if there's something in there that's wrong, it could come back to bite you.
So, David Strom, you mentioned that he's your governor now. So, give me a sense of how he's made your life better as your governor.
Well, if I ever want to remove the genitals of a child, he's made it very easy. This is a transgender sanctuary state, and I don't think most people understand what that means. I mean, it sounds kind of vague and generic, but, in the law, if a non-custodial parent kidnaps a child and brings them to Minnesota, and I'm not joking, you can kidnap a child as a non-custodial parent, bring them to Minnesota for, what they euphemistically call gender-affirming care. The state of Minnesota will fight to keep you in this state against court orders from other states.
This is who he is.
Yeah, there was a provision in our human rights law that defined gender as a protected class, but right after that, it said none of this applies to people attracted to minor children, and they stripped that out of the law, and so. And it says specifically you cannot be discriminated against because of attraction to any person. And so it used to say any person except children, and they took that out. So there are actually now pedophiles are a protected class in the state of Minnesota.
Because of Tim Walz.
Because of Tim Walz. It's still illegal to be one, but if you are, quote, a minor attracted person who hasn't been caught, but, there are people out there who, are, quote, minor attracted people. And if you...
So you can't discriminate against them? That's the theory? Is this in, like, employment, too? Like, so if you had a daycare and you found out that one of the applicants was attracted to children, you wouldn't be able to stop them on that basis?
No, you wouldn't. Now, if they are a registered sex offender, you can. But let's say they're a minor attracted person who, has pictures of kids up on the wall, but they're all legal, hangs around, the playground or schools, but, hasn't been caught acting. That's a protected class.
It's disgraceful. But what a despicable piece of garbage this guy is. One other element here I want to bring up before our time runs out, David, which is he's a very radical figure on abortion. We heard in Virginia the former governor Ralph Northam indicate that guy's a pediatrician. That should scare the hell out of you. He said, "Hey, if a baby is born as the result of a botched abortion." Then we'll have to make a decision about whether or not we let the kid live after birth. Yeah. We'll put him aside and make a decision. Tim Walz appears to be, if you're just doing it by head count, even more radical because my friend Mary Margaret Olahan reported this past week for the Daily Signal, at least 8 babies who were born alive in botched abortions were left to die in the state of Minnesota, according to the Minnesota Department of Health, since Governor Tim Walz took office. And that we actually don't know how many children were killed under these circumstances because Tim Walz removed the reporting requirements, so now we don't actually know what the true number is. This is crazy, David Strom.
Well, it is crazy, but I mean, he is truly, truly radical. And in fact, when he was asked, "Are you a moderate or are you a progressive?" he said, "Oh, I'm a progressive." He's very explicit about that. And the reason why he was featured in that book, Winning the Wellstone Way, is he went to Camp Wellstone, which is the Democrats' sort of training camp for progressive candidates. So I don't know if people remember Paul Wellstone. He was actually a professor of mine. I went to Carleton where he taught. And, he was a nice guy, but he was crazy. I mean, he was just insanely radical. He wasn't a Marxist, but he was Marxist adjacent. There's nothing moderate or avuncular about this guy. I mean, I would be very surprised if he doesn't have a blow up at the debate because he's also very thin-skinned. If you've been around him, and he's in his second term as governor, that guy, if he gets annoyed, will explode. I've seen him explode at reporters. I've seen him explode at ordinary citizens who get under his skin. When he's controlled, he's actually a very good speaker. He conveys this sort of passion. He uses vague terms that hit emotional erogenous zones for people. That's why he was picked. But, you haven't seen him actually interact with anybody who's hostile.
Yeah.
And he does that very badly.
Well, maybe he'll bring back the old Biden move, challenge people to push-up contests or call them lying dog-faced pony soldiers or something. We'll see. In the meantime, Minnesota resident David Strom, thank you very much. I think the headline from our conversation today is that a Minnesota resident warns against Tim Walz being given more power. I totally agree with you. All right, sir. Good to talk to you today. We started the show by pointing out that the head of the Olympics, the president of the IOC, is now saying that science cannot distinguish between men or women anymore. It's just not possible. XY chromosome, XX. What does that even mean? Nobody quite knows. So let's just ignore it. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Algerian boxer Imain Khalif, with what they say is XY chromosomes, that would be a male, just won Olympic gold. He went undefeated. Boxing against women, just won. Not to spoil it for you or anything. Riley Gaines is condemning this. She says, let me repeat this. A male has taken a woman's Olympic gold. This is what they call progress. It's the ultimate betrayal of fairness, safety, and women, she says. She's right about that. Your calls coming up, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Hey, good afternoon to you. It is now 5:35, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us today, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. A lot of calls pouring in. I want to take a couple of them. We've got Tim Walz joining the ticket this week with Kamala Harris, and he's been an unmitigated disaster as a running mate. Couldn't happen to better people. Tony wants to weigh in on this from beautiful Tampa, Florida, line 5. Tony, good afternoon, sir. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Vince. This sucker, who's the vice president for Kamala Harris, he wants to put tampon machines in the men's locker rooms.
What does that tell you? What does that tell you about this?
That tells me a lot. Excuse me, that tells me a lot. I played 4 years of high school football. I could never imagine coming back into the locker room and there'd be a tampon machine there.
I know.
I could never imagine that.
I know.
You know how you deal with people like this? I apologize for saying this to you. You know how you deal with people like this? You hang them. You hang them? People like that. Yeah, you hang them. You hang them. You hang people that want to put tampon machines in the boys' locker room.
No.
You don't do that. You don't do that kind of stuff, man.
No, you're right. You don't do that stuff, but you don't hang them.
Man.
All right, Tony, thank you. Appreciate the call. I agree with the stupidity of putting tampons in the boys' room. I don't agree with hanging the guy. I think what we need to do is turn to mockery. He deserves mockery. He deserves to be drummed out of polite society and laughed at until he doesn't return, until he hangs his head in shame. That's the appropriate response to this. These are ridiculous human beings who should have no access to the levers of power whatsoever. Let's see here. I've got Hoke calling in from Round Hill, line 1. Hoke, good afternoon, sir. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Hey, Vince, I can't wait for J.D. Vance to get this guy on the debate stage, but does anybody besides me think that Walz looks like the perfect love child of Howard Dean and Michael Dukakis?
Well, I hadn't really put the pieces together on that yet. I'm going to have to spend some time staring at photos to assess whether you're right about it. But this guy is out of control.
You know, I did 23 years active in reserves, and I can't imagine. I've never known a sergeant major, master sergeant, whatever you want to call him, that would walk away from his command at the time they needed him the most.
It is crazy, isn't it? And the media are trying to dance away from it right now. They're trying to make all sorts of excuses for this. But when you talk to the guys who actually served with and under him, I haven't seen a single person who's come out and was like, yeah, he was great, and he got out at the right time, and nobody cares. In fact, a lot of these guys care. They're pretty offended that he did it, and they've been holding on to it for years.
I like how they came out with the supposed letter from 50 military people supporting him. Is that kind of like the 51 senior intelligence guys that signed the Hunter Biden laptop letter?
Yeah, these letters have never been scams before, have they? Yeah, I totally agree with you, Hoke. It's a good point. Thank you. Hoke in Round Hill, always a good call. Also, always a good call. Donna from Frederick now calling in on line 3. Donna wants to weigh in on all of the various assassination attempts against President Trump. Donna, good afternoon. Is Donna there with us? Donna's been waiting so patiently. Okay. Hey, well, Donna wanted to indicate that, we found out about this Pakistani guy who had spent some time in Iran, who the Biden administration wants credit for arresting and thwarting an assassination attempt. He was trying to find hitmen to kill Trump, although the Biden administration's press release on the subject said a politician. They weren't as explicit as they should have been, which is Donald Trump, once again, being threatened with assassination. She's pointing out something that deserves a lot of attention today, which is that Biden released this guy into the country. That the only reason he was here was because of Biden. Just the News with this report this week. FBI headline, FBI lets suspect in plot to kill Trump into U.S. on parole despite terror ties. Iran trip, memos show. The FBI allowed Asif Raza Merchant, the Pakistani man charged with plotting with Tehran to assassinate Donald Trump and others, to enter the U.S. in April with special permission known as, quote, significant public benefit parole. Public benefit? What public benefit was this guy? Even though he was flagged on a terrorism watch list and recently traveled to Iran, according to government documents reviewed by Just the News. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force interviewed Merchant, fingerprinted him, and inspected the contents of his electronic devices when he arrived at the George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, but then let him leave with the special parole that expired on May 11th, the memo state. Quote, subject was polite and cooperative throughout encounter, the FBI interview memo reads. Subject's notable travel outside of country of citizenship includes a recent trip to Iran. What? Merchant wasn't arrested until July 12th, after a confidential human source ascertained that he had tried to line up assassins and was planning to leave the United States, the FBI said. The memos add a new twist to an assassination plot that was uncovered before Trump was shot by a 20-year-old American in Butler, Pennsylvania, but not announced until earlier this week. Authorities say they don't believe there is connection between the two assassination plots. The FBI declined to comment about the documents obtained by Just the News, but the JTTF interview summary and immigration records give some rich detail about what the Bureau knew before it allowed Merchant to enter the country and what conditions they placed on his entry. The immigration records from his arrival in Houston on April 13th clearly stated in bright red that he was flagged by the Department of Homeland Security database with the identifier watch list, in all caps, and denoted as a lookout qualified person of interest. Despite direct travel to a country with known terrorist activity, the memo relays that Merchant was, quote, released without incident into the United States and was free to travel to desired destination, which was listed as a family member's home in Texas. There you go. So once again, how often is this going to happen? Some version of this story. Oh yeah, that guy was on the terror watch list, and the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, released him into the country where he could do some sort of awful, awful harm. Whether it's women who are being raped or murdered in the United States, or it's now an attempted assassination yet again on President Trump. The Biden administration releasing this guy into the country despite 6 million red flags. It's just another reason they should not be in power. Just a horrific, once again, judgment on the part of the Biden administration and the Harris administration here. Let me see here. Let me bring in Paul from Woodbridge now on line 4. He wants to weigh in on the Secret Service's failures on July 13th. Paul, good afternoon, sir. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Any Paul? No Paul. All right. Well, we tried. Paul wanted to raise the fact that it looked like Congress was caught flat-footed when questioning these Secret Service officials. Not everybody. There were a couple, Josh Hawley's and others, who were well-equipped for that Q&A. But you're right. It is frustrating. Isn't it the most frustrating thing in the world to watch members of Congress who don't even know the basic details of some of these scandals begin asking questions? It's like when they questioned the tech leaders, and they were asking, like practically asking, like, how do I turn my computer on? And you're like, that's not the kind of question you should be wasting your time with. But there they were. Or they give speeches. They waste their time up there. Speaking of tech, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the censorship efforts that the left is always attempting to lead against the rest of us. We've got some new information this week about Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign and how Biden officials were able to use the big tech companies to censor all sorts of Americans on a lot of issues that we haven't really talked about. We've obviously talked at great length about the Hunter Biden laptop and the effort that the government in part led, the FBI included, to silence conversation around Hunter Biden's laptop. But now we're getting some new video that's coming out, Zoom calls following the 2020 election cycle that show Biden-Harris staffers revealing how they actually manipulated the, quote, disinformation narrative to hide Joe Biden's cognitive decline from voters. Daily Caller with that headline here. Biden-Harris staffers reveal how they manipulated disinformation to hide Biden's mental decline from voters. In the audio, you can hear a couple of people speaking, all Biden officials. This guy's Rob Flaherty. He was digital director for Biden-Harris, and he said that the DNC had put together a program to track and censor what they referred to as disinformation. Now, this is not stuff that are lies. These are just things that are politically inconvenient.
You know, one of the smartest things that I think the party did itself was over the last couple of years, they actually invested in a team that Tim runs, and you'll hear from Tim, to detect and track misinformation and misinformation narratives in the sort of various corners of the internet, and then actually go out and flag it to platforms as a violation of their policy. And so that work, I mean, the stuff that they did was a critical asset. That piece of infrastructure, I think, was one of the more important decisions that was made in sort of the party space over the last couple of years.
In layman's terms, the Biden campaign was able to induce censorship on the part of the big tech companies. They censored the themes that they didn't want getting out there. Not a surprise to you, but there they were bragging about it in this Zoom call. And here are some of the narratives they say that they were able to censor.
We brought Becca on to sort of think through, okay, now that we have these misinformation narratives, what do we actually do? It is one thing to know that there is a lot of conversation online about corruption or mental fitness or any of these things, or the vice president's record on the crime bill, which was sort of a controversial piece of legislation in the early 90s. But it was another to go, okay, now what?
Yeah, now how do we censor those things? And they were able to, as he says, successfully do that. Now, under questioning from Congressman Jim Jordan, this same character, Rob Flaherty, was unable to define specifically what he means by mis or disinformation.
What's the definition of misinformation?
Congressman, certainly there's different and varying definitions of mis and disinformation. At the end of the day, the platform.
Tell me the difference. Tell me what misinformation is.
Congressman, these are decisions that the platforms ultimately get to make about how they.
I'm not asking that. I'm a simple question. What's misinformation?
Well, Congressman, I think it's important in the context of these.
How about you, Professor? Can you tell me what misinformation is?
I assume it would be saying something was completely untrue.
Saying something that's untrue, but with no intent. No intent. Disinformation, this is what all the misinformation experts tell us. Misinformation, saying something that's not accurate. Disinformation, saying something that's not accurate with the intent to mislead. Right?
That sounds right to me.
You agree, Mr. Seligman? That's the common definition in the misinformation industry out there?
Yes, my understanding.
Okay, that's the definition. So now, Mr. Flaherty, how about this question? When the Biden administration told the American people that the vaccinated couldn't get the virus, was it misinformation or disinformation?
Congressman, again, we were communicating the best medical research that we had at the time on behalf of a group of some of the best doctors in the world in Atlanta and Bethesda.
When the Biden administration told the American people that the virus didn't come from a lab, was that misinformation or disinformation?
Congressman, again, I can't speak to discussions that were had on that topic. It's been a couple of years, but again, generally.
The White House put pressure on us to censor the lab leak theory. This was something the White House cared about, so much so that the top people at Facebook were having a group discussion on it. So I'm just asking, when they said that, was that misinformation or disinformation?
Congressman, I can't recall the specific example.
When the Biden administration said that masks work, was that misinformation or disinformation?
Again, Congressman, we were communicating the best research at the time, but I also believe that was a discussion that began in the previous administration as well.
How about what Professor Zawicki brought up, Mr. Flaherty? When the White House said there was no such thing as natural immunity, was that misinformation or disinformation?
Again, Congressman, I am not a medical expert.
Great questioning, by the way. Just a great line of questioning from Jim Jordan, because it demonstrates the abuses that come with the government calling the shots on what you and I are allowed to communicate about, including when the government's mistaken. The most innocent explanation for any of this would be, well, the government was mistaken. Okay, so that would fall into that misinformation category that Jim Jordan was just talking about. But that is not the basis to censor the American people. In fact, the American people have a First Amendment right to these conversations that the government has no right to trample upon whatsoever. And yet, what did they do? Now, back to this Zoom call, you have a woman called Rebecca Rinkovich, who you heard that guy Rob Flaherty refer to her as Becca. She was the director of rapid response for Joe Biden in 2020. And here's what she described as disinformation.
We saw a huge amount of volume and a lot of impact on narratives like Joe Biden was being manipulated by the radical left and disinformation around his mental acuity. We targeted folks based on...
Isn't that amazing? And now, of course, like the entire left actually advances that talking point, that Joe Biden's not mentally with it enough to be their candidate.
Online behavioral cues, building out personas based on the type of content they were consuming, what they were searching, the kinds of websites they were visiting, so that we could target folks in real time as they were exposed to that disinformation.
And she would go on in that call to say that their censorship was very successful in terms of shutting down conversations around Biden's mental acuity.
A couple notes on sort of our eventual top line impact. We found over the course of our campaign in tracking with our traditional research and in-flight ads measurement that the risk and the hit concern around mental acuity in particular went down by 8 points over the course of our campaign. And in looking at the number of folks who moved in vote choice, we saw about 200K folks shore up their votes for the president-elect based on the ads that we served in our campaign.
200,000 is well over the margin by which Biden wins the 2020 election, I should point out. So 200,000 votes, they say. Their censorship campaign around the issues of his mental acuity Big success, they said, as they were able to shut down conversations among the American people. There's a local news outlet in Montana called KTVH that at this hour is reporting that Donald Trump's plane has landed in Billings, Montana, after a reported mechanical issue, they say. President Trump has an event tonight in Bozeman, which is about 150 miles from Billings. So apparently, according to this report, he's now expected to take a private plane to Bozeman, having landed in Billings with a mechanical issue. That's according to the local news outlet. President Trump himself gave a message just a few minutes ago, didn't address the plane's issues at all, if there are any. He just said he's ready to speak in Montana.
We just landed in a really beautiful place, Montana. So beautiful flying over, and you just look down, and that's the way it's supposed to be. But we have a very high rating in Montana. We have a lot of popularity. I like them. They like me. But I'm here to do some fundraisers and most importantly, to support Tim Sheehy, who's running for the U.S. Senate.
All right, so there's the president making some remarks. As always, keep him and our country in your prayers. Have a great weekend. The great one, Mark Levin, up next here on WMAL.